Hi everyone, this is Keane Manning here, and I'm just going to talk about J. Lionel Richardson. So as you can see, our topic is about Waterford's world famous daffodil breeder, who has been lost in time somewhat in the popular consciousness of Waterford City. So hopefully this talk goes away to sort of reclaiming his memory and his legacy as really a pioneer in his field. So before we begin, I'd like to thank Anne Cullen and the Waterford Regional Garden Club for the invitation to speak. So I know this is not the format that was originally planned, but all the same delighted to put the research on Richardson in place and to basically give a broad sketch of his life and career. So we'll be going from the start in 1890 with his birth in Tremor, and we'll be finishing up then when his death in 1961, with a few little pieces in between as well to learn a bit more about J. Lionel Richardson. So what stoked my interest originally, you're probably all familiar with T.N. Fuhr's edited collection, I Was a Day in Waterford, an anthology of writing about Waterford City and County from the 18th to the 20th century, which was first published in 2001. So anyone not familiar with that book, there's a wonderful article in it called The Waterford Larder and Famous Flowers by a journalist called Kees van Huyck. And Huyck was born in Holland and was travelling in Ireland at the outbreak of World War II. He was unable to return to his homeland until after the war. So he continued to practice his profession as a journalist, and he became a columnist with the Irish Independent. So in around 1945, as he toured Ireland and published his findings in the study An Irish Panorama, which was basically released in around 1946. His tour must have been at the very end of 1945, with World War II well and truly over, because we get an impression of as prosperous factories and motor cars gliding, quote, like sleek beetles, finish quote, along the quay, which was obviously in sharp contrast to the previous years. In relation then to the famous flowers of the piece, the Dutch journalist writes, "A Waterford man is the greatest daffodil grower in the world. He started as a hobby, but when this proved to be too expensive, he took it up as a business. The varieties which he has raised, beautifying the gardens of the world, elaborately docketed and catalogued in much sought-after books, they bear names of Irish towns like Kenmare, Blarney or Glengariff, or famous racecourses, and lately of modern battles like Narvik and Matapan." Richardson exported his bulbs as far away as New Zealand. He also sent many to Holland, and as Van Huyck says, or Van Huyck, that may sound like exporting tea from Ireland to China, but it is a fact all the same. The journalist goes on to say, "These Waterford bulbs are worth their weight in gold. For a variety named Krakatoa, after the volcanic island between Java and Sumatra, £100 was offered for one single bulb, but Richardson would only sell the 4 he had of that variety for a cool 1,000. Hence, of his more exclusive varieties, £5 a bulb is about the moderate average price." So think about those prices going back to the 1940s and literally just after the Second World War. Our Dutch friend then went through the gardens, where he goes on to describe that there was 175 beds spread, more like so many low mattresses on the earth, each carefully covered by sea sand like a porous eider down. The daffodils had already begun pushing up their green stalks. He describes, in a good month's time, these huge wards of beds, each bed 60 feet long by 3 feet wide, will have their protective screens around them, made of Kentish hop and 6 feet high, preventing the wind from spoiling the blooms. He finishes then, "I have seldom seen outside Holland such spotless order, such perfect regimentation, as if pensioned sergeant majors had been recruited as gardeners, for even the stalks grew as if long invisible rulers. In a special treasure plot, neat slates divide the bulbous growths. No wonder that even the Dutch, who felt that here was a man from whom they could learn, and invited him to judge at their world-famous floral shows. So I think it's fair to describe, or to say, that Richardson was very much at the forefront, and I think in Waterford we tend to keep going back to figures like Luke Wadden and Thomas Francis Marr and John Milan of recent times, but here we have a figure very much unique in Waterford history, who should be promoted a little bit more. So as I said, we're going to kind of briefly sketch. So that was the inspiration, was Van Hoek's essay in Feuer's edited anthology. So we'll move on to our next slide now, the early years of Joseph Lionel Richardson. So he was born on the 4th of December 1890 at Westcliff in Tramore, County Waterford. His father was William Richardson of Westcliff, while his mother is recorded as Laura Emily Richardson, and actually her maiden name was also Richardson. William and Laura Emily were married around the 7th of December 1889, with their marriage registered at Lisburn, County Antrim. William was recorded as 26 years of age, with his profession noted as merchant, which was also his own father's profession. William, we believe, was born somewhere between 1862 and 1863, and from his obituary in the Belfast Newsletter of the 11th of December 1946, it notes that his death took place yesterday. He was noted as an MBE from Pembroke Lodge in Dunmurry, County Antrim, and formerly Prospect House, Waterford. He was 84 years of age at the time. William Richardson, so this is Lionel's father again, he was the son of the late Joseph Richardson of Springfield, Lisburn, and he belonged to a family which made an important contribution to the industrial life of the province, particularly in the textiles industry. He himself was engaged in business in the south of Ireland for a large part of his business career, but had retired several years ago. He was a member of the Society of Friends. His wife died, this is Laura Emily, some years ago, but he is survived by his only son, Mr. J. Lionel Richardson. And it's noted that his brother was a stockbroker, Walter J. Richardson. So that's a bit about Lionel's father, William. So Lionel's mother, Laura Emily, unfortunately, we start with her death. So the Munster Express recorded on the 17th of June 1927 that the death occurred on Sunday after a brief illness of Miss Laura Emily Richardson, wife of Mr. William Richardson, Prospect House, Waterford, and mother of Mr. Lionel Richardson, Honorary Secretary of the Waterford Hunt. The deceased lady was the third daughter of the late Mr. John Richardson, Lambeg House, Lisburn, County Antrim. She was aged 59 years when she died on the 12th of June 1927, and basically her death was a result of heart failure, essentially. So her father, we know Laura Emily's father, was noted as a Justice of the Peace, and he had died in 1900. So now to talk a little bit more about the man himself, Lionel Richardson. He lived at Weston and then moved to Prospect House at Kilcohan in Waterford City. We know he was educated at Malvern College, and upon leaving Cambridge Union, he frequently visited the Daffodil Gardens at Brodie Prestonay in Radnorshire and Guy Wilson of Antrim. We now have a quote from Lionel's wife, Helen, who we'll be talking about quite a lot over the course of this slide. She described to the New Yorker that Lionel was a very shy man, and he had ambitions in his youth to become an engineer. But he came of a hunting, shooting, fishing family, and he was expected to be a country gentleman and kept quite clear of anything industrial. But Lionel didn't have an idler's temperament, and just before the First World War he got interested in the genetics of the narcissus family, and it wasn't long before his hobby of crossbreeding different strains of daffodils had become so expensive that to support it he had to go into trade. So basically we can see that Lionel Richardson comes from, you could say, a Quaker background, definitely with lineage from the province of Ulster, has a great interest in breeding daffodils, and this hobby becomes so expensive that he basically has to take it up as a professional career. So in the next slide we'll talk a little bit about his amateur status before going into more detail about his professional pursuits of daffodil breeding. An article in the Waterford News outlined that these visits, such as to Guy Wilson and Antrim, inspired a great interest in daffodil growing and the development of highly specialised bulbs. His breeding of daffodils began with acquiring material from the gardens at Lissadell, sparing no expense in his endeavours to develop an impressive collection. A chance of a pollinated seed on Mary Copeland opened the way for his many excellent double daffodils. Richardson's bulbs will be named after Irish towns like Blarney, Kenmare, and race courses, and to battlefields such as Matapan and Narvik, as we said already. So you can see a selection from Richardson's catalogues. So we have Corofin, Fermoy, Narvik there as well. So those of you with more green fingers than myself and definitely more knowledge of horticulture would probably recognise how impressive these daffodils are. So as an amateur, Richardson exhibited his daffodils at flower shows in London after the end of the First World War. We know that he displayed his flowers for the first time at the Royal Horticultural Society show in Dublin in 1915, and he was to receive the Lord Ardilaun Cup for a collection of 50 varieties. So forgive my pronunciation for some of these names that have already offended the Dutch community and probably everyone else with my pronunciation. So we'll just spend another couple of minutes just looking, or another couple of seconds rather, looking at his flowers from his amateur status before moving to his professional career. So we know from around 1922 he relinquished his amateur status. As we said, the pursuit was just becoming too expensive to just be justified as a hobby. His passion for cultivating daffodils became a successful business, with the United States a popular destination for his bulbs. He would exhibit at shows in Birmingham, London and America, which allowed him to demonstrate his skill in horticulture. By 1927 he had won numerous gold medals at gardening exhibitions in Dublin and London, as well as garnering 5 first prizes for his daffodils at the Horticultural Hall in London that year. Again, we go to Helen Richardson in that wonderful New Yorker piece by John McCartan. She says, "I don't know whether you'd call what we've been doing a Prospect House an art or a science, but I do know that Lionel worked purely by instinct, and alas never got around to putting down on paper all the things he knew about the flowers he loved." So very much devoted to the actual pursuit rather than recording the methodology to possibly preserve his own legacy. So you see this throughout, that really the voice of Lionel Richardson is through his wife Helen, and that New Yorker piece, which proves very significant when trying to piece the story of Lionel and Helen Richardson together. So you can see the photograph in this slide. It comes from a piece called Through the Windows of Memory by James A. Wheeling. The World of Roses and Daffodils, which was in the Evening Echo in 1980. So a few quotes from that article. With Mr. Richardson, bulb growing was a business that began as a hobby, as I've repeated numerous times, in 1911, a few years after he left school. His best customers in the splendid enterprise he developed over the years were in New Zealand and America. The secret of his success was in his motto, quality, not quantity. The Richardson bulb farm was a sheltered dell of about 2.5 acres in the grounds of Prospect House. There are some 8,000 different daffodil names listed in the RHS register, though probably not more than 1,000 of these were grown at any one period. But to this formidable list, Mr. Richardson contributed between 8 and 10 new daffodils each year for 3 decades. The fact that it was 5 years before the Richardsons had even 12 of the new bulbs did not deter them at all. The New Zealanders and Australians are the most discerning customers, he told. The Americans are to want quantity rather than quality. And then of the picture we have here, the photographer says, since I took my picture at the Chelsea show in 1936, I have seen daffodils running the colour gamut from white to yellow and on to deep orange red, sometimes erroneously described as scarlet. So to any of you more academic about the field of daffodils would probably appreciate that quote. So we can really get a measure of Richardson and the pace in which he took, and this is reinforced by the idea of quality over quantity. So it was striving for perfection rather of his bulbs than anything else. So I think it's definitely worth looking at Mrs. Richardson, considering we've mentioned her a couple of times already. So it was Miss Helen K. Thoburn, I imagine is how you pronounce it. So we can see a clip from a newspaper article from the Irish Independent, a wonderful photograph of their wedding day. So if anyone can't read the caption, it says, Waterford man weds. Mr. J. Lionel Richardson of Waterford and Miss Helen K. Thoburn photographed after their wedding at St. Ethelburga's Church, London. So it's from the Irish Independent, the 17th of February 1933. So a little bit more detail. We don't have an awful lot on Helen. We do know the Munster Express records on the 10th of February that Helen had an address of 2 Swan Court, Chelsea. A little bit more background comes from, again, the wonderful New Yorker article, which, commenting on the daffodils surrounding Prospect House, almost all of these are daffodils and Mrs. Richardson, but there are a few cultivated by Guy L. Wilson, who, when he was alive, was a friendly rival of Lionel's. He goes on to then say he was from the north of Ireland, as was Lionel's father. She then says, I, as in Helen, originated up there myself, but my roots have gone very deep here in Kilcohan, in Waterford. Just for a little bit of trivia, some of you would probably recognise the name of that church. So it's one of the oldest, I believe, in London. It survived the Great Fire of London. It was partially damaged during the Blitz of the Second World War and was then later completely blown up by the IRA in the 1990s. So a little connection there, I believe, with that church. Continue then with Helen, just to read out the caption we have here of this wonderful photograph from the Irish Press. Mrs. J. L. Richardson, Prospect House, Waterford, with her first prize winner in Class 34, the category being Best Jersey Cow, which was Ardmore Bow at Waterford Show yesterday. So Helen, to John McCartan, details but Prospect House isn't exclusively devoted to daffodils, not by long odds. Although the tree gardeners around the place concentrate on flowers and are helped by a local lad, Helen says, I grow such things as tomato plants for the market, and I have a fine big herd of Jersey cattle grazing across the road. I also have an old-fashioned Victorian garden. In Helen's own pursuit of horticulture, she would go on to win the Peter Barr Memorial Cup in 1960 for daffodil growing, which was an honour which was bestowed to her husband in 1931. So Lionel would win the Barr Memorial Cup in 1931, and nearly 30 years later Helen would achieve the same feat. In detailing a little bit more about the cultivation process, Helen would describe that it takes 5 years, to transform a daffodil seed into a bulb, and out of 5,000 seeds, you'd be lucky to be rewarded with 200 bulbs that you wanted to keep. In May 1971, she details that she sent 1,700 blooms to the London show. 190 varieties, but usually she says we would send more than that, about 3,000 on average. She describes these show blooms are only cut flowers we're interested in. To strengthen the bulbs, we knock the heads off the plants, and after they've blossomed, which is what the bulb do with their tulips. Daffodils have never excited frenzied speculation such as Holland had when the tulip craze was at its height in the 17th century. But while they've never been as fantastically inflated in price as the tulip bulbs, ours have occasionally proved quite valuable. So we go back in time, we go back to 1921, and Helen details how Lionel introduced a bulb called Fortune that was sold for £80. And I myself, so we go forward in time a bit, Helen had the luck to grow one bulb that returned 50. So even in 1921, so just as Lionel was switching from amateur to professional, managed to sell a bulb called Fortune for £80. So it's a mark of what's to come, I imagine it again, emphasising quality over quantity. Helen details that in the operation of Prospect House, though the idea of making a profit never occurred to Lionel or to me. She describes how they wanted to break even, or at least to keep our losses within bounds, and that's what I'm trying to do right now. So again, this is the piece from the 70s with the New Yorker article again. So we're going to take a slight detour now in our next slide, and we're going to talk about one of the big social events in Waterford in the 20th century, the first half of the 20th century, which was the Waterford Hunt Ball. So the photograph you have here comes from the Munster Express, and it's the 9th of January 1959, and the caption reads, having a chat when our cameraman called to the Arundel Ballroom on Wednesday night at Waterford Hunt Ball were, from left, Mrs. Lionel Richardson, Honorary Secretary, who was mainly responsible for the success of the event, Mr. N. Odlum. You then have Mr. J. L. Richardson, you have Colonel Gabbett and Mrs. Gabbett, and Mrs. N. Odlum, and the photo was by Farrell. So you have Mrs. Helen Richardson far left, Lionel Richardson then is the centre of the photograph with the glasses. So you probably recall we noted earlier that Lionel himself was a member of the Hunt Ball around the time of the death of his mother. For a little bit more detail of the event which took place in '59, it was on the front page. The headline, Waterford Hunt Ball's glamorous success. It goes on to say, a traditionally gay, colourful function, Waterford's Hunt Ball in the Arundel Ballroom on Wednesday night once again proved a spectacular success. The fine attendance of about 350 couples included society notables, members of hunts from Kilkenny, Wexford, Tipperary, Galway, Limerick, and of course Waterford, representatives of beagle clubs and dancing enthusiasts from all over Southern Ireland. In every respect, the organisers scored yet another brilliant triumph. It then talks a little bit about the music on the night, going on to say, since his band was first engaged to supply the music for this important social gathering, Mick Delahunty has never failed to give maximum satisfaction to the patrons of the Waterford Hunt Ball in the matter of pleasant, lively and danceable music. Like good wine, his band seems to improve with the years, and it is true to say that on Wednesday night they played even better than on previous occasions. That at least was the general feeling among patrons. So to just move away slightly from the music and atmosphere, we have a little bit of information on the decorations of the events described as arresting effects. Without a cosy, comfortable and bright atmosphere, any social function of this nature is liable to prove a failure, or at least it would lose some of its attractiveness and glamour. A contributory factor in providing this gay, happy feeling, apart from a bright and breezy programme of dance music, is the artistic decorations of the ballroom. To Mrs. Lionel Richardson, Prospect House, Honorary Secretary, ably assisted by Mrs. Dawnay and Mr. Goldsmith and his staff at Prospect House, fell the onerous responsibility of creating a decorative scheme that would meet with the unanimous approval of patrons. That she and her helpers utilised the festoons, lanterns, evergreens and other decorations with most arresting effect was evident. It was a great tribute to Mrs. Richardson's self-sacrificing efforts that the decorative scheme won the spontaneous approval of the large attendance. So for a little bit more information, we now go from 1959 back in time to 1947. Again, we have the Munster Express from the 10th of January, which says, very credible results crown the efforts of the Hunt Committee in receiving the old-time glamour of the Waterford Hunt Ball. Many Hunt Club dances have been held in Waterford and district in later years, but it is 18 years since the official Waterford Hunt Ball took place. The scenes of animation in the vicinity of the City Hall, the venue of the function, were reminiscent of the halcyon days of the Waterford Hunt. Scores of cars filled both sides of the Mall from the quay to Parnell Street, from which emerged red-coated members of the club, with gorgeously dressed and bejewelled ladies. The mayor's parlour was kindly lent for the ladies' cloakroom, and some of the corporation offices served the gentlemen's requirements. The kitchen was the general bar, with Mrs. Galway's courteous staff dispensing refreshments. A cocktail bar, gaily bedecked with evergreens, was situated underneath the gallery in the large room where the dancing took place. There was also tastefully decorated, with the council chamber acting as a retiring room for resting dancers. The committee room adjoining provided super facilities, with the famous catering of Lawlers of Naas in charge. To take the chill off, all the large fireplaces contained well-tended and cheerful fires. A noteworthy and very pleasant feature, which excited much favourable comment, especially by the ladies, were the stands of tulips, daffodils and other spring flowers on the supper table. No doubt Mr. Lionel Richardson, the famous florist, could account for these. The highest praise is due to the energetic and efficient Honorary Secretary, Mrs. Lionel Richardson. So, trawling back through the papers, we can see that Mr. and Mrs. Richardson both attended the Waterford Hunt Ball in 1934, and from the Munster Express piece that I just quite extensively quoted, it appears that was the last one to 1947, when Mrs. Richardson is noted as Honorary Secretary, and however, as with newspapers, we do have a note of such a hunt ball in 1939, with again Mrs. Richardson as Secretary and it took place in Corramore. So perhaps it's the first time the Hunt Ball was back in the city for 18 years. We're not sure. So now we might, after our little romp through music and balls and jewellery and fashion, we go back to our daffodil and the Engelhart Cup. So for the photograph we have here, comes from the Waterford News on the 30th of April 1937. In the photograph you can see 12 varieties, all raised by the exhibitor Lionel Richardson. Included Ballyferris, Royal Ransom and Seedling under numbers. So we know that Richardson won the Engelhart Cup 22 times, which is, to those that are not familiar, a major trophy offered by the Royal Horticultural Daffodils Society. The Engelhart Cup was named in honour of Reverend George Engelhart for his revolutionary endeavours in cultivating daffodils, and was established in 1913 by the RHS. It is awarded annually to the display of the best 12 daffodils, all bred and raised from seed by the exhibitor. It is the most coveted award of the Daffodil Show in London. So to look at one of the daffodils mentioned in this exhibit, Royal Ransom, is next up on our slide. So you can see it there, Royal Ransom. It was awarded the medal for the best flower in the Daffodil Show, a glorious incumbent cup of deep orange red and smooth, flat, overlapping pernith, white overlaid with faint reddish buff, and it was shown by J.L. Richardson, Prospect, Waterford. So the image on the left is originally from Gardening Illustrated of 1937, and then obviously the one on the right is from a Richardson catalogue dated to 1957, so about 20 years later. So the catalogue actually gives a wonderful description of the flower. So it is noted as the best flower again in the London show, 1937. It was a large flower of splendid form with broad shovel-pointed segments of great substance and beautiful, smooth quality, a remarkable soft buff colour which develops a pinkish tint as the flower ages. It's described as medium-sized, well-proportioned crown of dull orange red, and its tall, strong stem with a short neck. So it's noted down as £60 per dozen, so quite a substantial amount of money for the 1950s. To continue describing this flower with a bit more background, we have the Irish Independent had a piece from the 18th of April 1940, and it reads, Mr. J. Lionel Richardson of Waterford has won at the Royal Horticultural Society show being held at Westminster a gold medal for a fine group of daffodils, amongst which are many excellent new seedlings of his own raising. He has also been awarded the Engelhart Cup, given for the best 12 varieties of daffodils raised by the exhibitor. Included in this group are a new and superior species topically named Narvik, which has an exquisitely formed pernith of rich yellow with a vivid orange cup, and another called Green Island, the large white cup of which is beautifully bordered with greenish yellow. A bloom, the latter was pronounced by the judges to be the best of all displayed in the competitive classes. So in relation to Narvik, we go to the Richardson catalogue again, this time 1966, and it is described as a superb red and yellow jewel, like brilliance, perfect alike in form, quality, balance and proportion. It is broad, smooth, clean out, clear golden yellow segments with a frilled goblet-shaped cup of deep, intense orange crimson. It is described as having a tall stem and is a vigorous plant. So in 66, each bulb in US dollars is worth 35 cents, and he's selling a dozen for £3 or $3.78. Again, another flower we heard mentioned was Green Island, and it was awarded a medal at the RHS show in 1946. And from the same catalogue from 1966, Green Island is described as a sensational flower of very large size, great substance, and waxen smooth texture, smooth rounded white segments of such immense width that they form an almost complete circle, well proportioned, shallow bowl-shaped frilled cup, greenish white at the base, inside passing to white, which in turn passes to a band of clear, cool, greenish lemon at the magical short neck, and a tall, strong stem. The plant is of great vigour and invaluable for breeding. So again, to quote the price of in the catalogue in US dollars, each bulb is 77 cents, or to buy a dozen would be for $8.40. So again, from the catalogue you get these wonderfully vivid descriptions that, as you can see, these black and white photographs kind of come to life with descriptions, and it's worth noting the price is also in US dollars. Obviously a big market in the US for the Richardsons. So you probably remember from earlier on in the Dutch journalist piece in the Irish Independent, or the Irish Independent journalist, a flower called Krakatoa, which we'll look at in a bit more depth. So we're 2/3 of the way through the slide. So this one is Krakatoa, and you can see the business side of the Richardsons' passion with a piece again from the Independent dated May 1940. It says some of Richardson bulbs command quite fantastic prices. These bulbs can be attained through Messrs. Sir James W. Mackey, Ltd, 23 Upper O'Connell Street, Dublin, while Messrs. Knowles and Son, the well-known Grafton Street florists, are acting as agents for sale at the Blooms. They are making special windows displays of these, which are attracting admiring crowds. The variety of daffodil he cultivated, named Krakatoa, named after the volcanic island, could reach up to £100 for a single bulb. And as you remember the quote from earlier, Richardson would only sell the 4 he had of that variety. This was in around 1945-46 for a cool £1,000. And again, of his most exclusive varieties, £5 a bulb is the moderate average price. So as you can see, for selling a bulb such as Krakatoa, he was receiving considerable interest and also financial reward. At the RHS show in London in 1945, Richardson's Krakatoa was deemed the most admired of a conspicuous feature, and it had taken Richardson 15 years to acquire the quality of bulbs to then develop them to perfection. It's noted as a large flower with broad, overlapping, deep golden yellow piraneth of fine substance and quality. The widely expanded cup is bright, flaming orange-red, beautifully flanged at the mouth. It's described as a fine and robust plant, and again, to quote the US currency, this time it looks that each one was going for 35 cents, and that the dozen would be for $3.78. So this is some time later, again probably the 1960s. So it was going for great prices in the 40s and 50s, and then you can see the price goes down by the 60s. So that is Krakatoa. This is one of his most famous bulbs, one of his most famous daffodils. We then go to a slide again on the Royal Horticultural Society itself. The photograph you can see comes from the Irish Press and is from the 19th of February 1953. The headline is "His Daffodils Earn a Medal." Mr. J. Lionel Richardson of Prospect House, Waterford, shows the Vetch Gold Medal he was awarded at the RHS General Meeting in London for his 40 years' work on raising new daffodils. So just to go back a bit to Richardson's many honours, in 1941 he was awarded the Gold Medal of Honour by the Royal Horticultural Society of Ireland for his conspicuous service to that pursuit. The Munster Express opined in 1942 that Richardson even sent blooms to Holland, which is something like exporting tea from Ireland to China. Such was the quality and reputation he had developed in the horticultural world. He was noted with such renown that he was even invited to judge in floral shows in the Netherlands. We have the description again from earlier on of the 175 beds and the diameters. So basically all his endeavours of quality over quantity, the military precision which we can see that he had in developing or cultivating his bulbs led to great renown and success. Along with his 22 Engelhart Cups, he won the Midland Daffodil Society's Bourne, Cartwright and Leamington Cups on numerous occasions, as well as 64 gold medals and copious amounts of first-class certificates for his cultivation of daffodils. In his 50th year of raising daffodils, Richardson became only the second Irishman after Frederick Moore to be made a vice president of the Royal Horticultural Society. So we know over the course of Richardson's 36 years of competing at the RHS shows, he also won the P.D. Williams Medal several times and the Vetch Memorial Gold Medal for his services in the cultivation of daffodils. The Irish Times notes that Richardson won widespread fame in 1958 by developing a pink cup daffodil, the first with a colour other than yellow. So I'm not fully sure, this is where my lack of knowledge of all things daffodil comes in, of what that flower or bulb or daffodil is. So hopefully someone could maybe point me in the direction of which daffodil they think it is. So just judging by the year, the description of the Irish Times, it would appear to be Salome, which was described as the best bloom in competitive class in the Midlands Daffodil Show in around 1958, which would tie up with the year the Irish Times quoted. So from the Richardson catalogue of 66, Salome described as bred from salmon trout and rose caprice. It's described as immensely broad, beautifully smooth and flat, of wonderfully thick, waxy texture. It has pure, glistening white. The long, rather straight pink crown of nearly trumpet length is slightly expanded and frilled at the mouth with a tinge of gold at the edge. A very robust plant. Now, the reason why I think it may be this bulb, Salome, is that in 66 it appears to be one of the most expensive bulbs. So we know in US currency he is selling a bulb for $14 or for £5. So that's something I would like clarification on. So if anyone wanted to get in touch with the Waterford Regional Garden Club to clarify that or give some insight, that would be greatly appreciated. So now we come to appreciation. So sadly, Lionel Richardson died in 1961, and there was this wonderful appreciation written in the Irish Times by WJT. And we have the quote with this photograph from a hunt ball in 1961. So the last ball that Lionel attended prior to his death. So the piece in the Irish Times then begins, "Those who knew him best will miss him most, for he was the perfect embodiment of a gentleman, shy, unassuming, and of unswerving integrity. He was kind and generous to a fault, while his judgment was level-headed and wise at all times. There is a rich symbolism in the fact that the flowers he created would come to life at the time when we commemorate the resurrection of our Lord. Here indeed is comfort for those who are bereaved. This is his gracious message to the mourner, proof and pledge of life eternal." The reflection of the times can be seen there in which Lionel lived. The idea of Richardson's work coming to life every spring would appear to be a most fitting thought. And of course, I think it's very appropriate that we talk in a little bit more depth about Lionel. Helen. The photograph here is of Petra Plunkett, Turkey Road, and Carmel Brett Duncannon, and it's of them admiring an exhibit of daffodils at the Tramore ICA, their spring flower show, which was held in Tramore House, and that was in 1971. The display was devised by Mrs. Lionel Richardson at Prospect House, and it won the exhibition at the Royal Horticultural Society Gold Medal, and this is noted by the Munster Express. Helen Richardson would continue to grow daffodils after the death of her husband, and she would go on to win 20 gold medals at the Royal Horticultural Show. However, this would sort of cover over the fact that things were very difficult in later life for Helen Richardson, and operations at Prospect House in Kilcohan and Waterford City. One such event would include a big barn blaze on around September 1964. So the Evening Echo actually would record this event, and it describes thousands of pounds worth of damage was caused last night when a barn containing a large quantity of farm equipment was destroyed by fire on the outskirts of Waterford City. The barn was the property of Mrs. Lionel Richardson at Prospect House, Kilcohan, Waterford, and was completely gutted. It was known the alarm was raised by the farm manager, Michael Nelson, who telephoned the fire brigade. The fire had a strong hold when the brigade arrived, and the roof soon collapsed. Firemen, however, succeeded in saving some equipment and some bales of hay from the blaze. It is believed over 200 bales of hay, 200 barrels of oats, as well as manure spreader and some other equipment were lost in the fire. The operations at Prospect House in Kilcohan also had personal tragedies as well. So if we go back in time again, on the 27th of June 1953, there is a report in the Irish Examiner of a found drowned verdict on County Cork herdsman. So the article details a verdict of found drowned, there being no evidence to show how he entered the water, was returned at the inquest in Waterford on John Draddy, a widower of Ballycotton, County Cork, and herdsman employed by Mr. Lionel Richardson, Prospect Farm, Kilcohan, Waterford. Draddy's body was recovered from the river shore at Waterford on Thursday. So this was in June 1953. Dr. L. Foley said that Dr. O'Keefe and he agreed that a bruise over the left eye and a cut on the back of Draddy's head were post-mortem injuries. A son, Robert Rady, and an adopted daughter, Teresa O'Donnell, gave evidence that when they returned from Waterford at 11 o'clock on Wednesday night, Rady had drink taken. John Goldsmith, land steward at Prospect Farm, said when he came on the scene on Wednesday night, Rady was in a violent temper. Rady walked away from the house and he did not see him again. So, tragedy there of Robert Rady, who worked at Prospect House, which occurred in 1953. So for all these wonderful stories we have and these wonderful flowers with full of colour, we also have these moments of tragedy and destruction showing up. So finally, you see the cover of the New Yorker, from which I've been quoting the article written by John McCartan on Helen Richardson extensively. So it's the issue from the 8th of May 1971. And basically from this magazine article we learn how Helen Richardson tries to maintain the work of her husband and his legacy, as well as progressing her own career as a horticulturist. So nearly 40 years after Van Hoek's visit, John McCartan writes, there are about 100,000 bulbs planted in the fields around Prospect House. There are roughly 350 named varieties, but hundreds more never develop into anything worth cultivating or christening. It takes 5 years to transform a daffodil seed into a bulb, and out of 5,000 seeds, you'll be lucky to be rewarded with 200 bulbs you wanted to keep. Prospect House has 80 customers, so this is in 1971, in the US pedigrees, and so important that Mrs. Richardson had them detailed on a computer, which she named or is known as George, which is used by Dr. Tom Throckmorton, another name I've murdered there, who lives in Des Moines, Iowa. And it notes that the head gardener was Jack Goldsmith, who's been there 43 years in 1971. So you can remember Jack or John's Goldsmith showed up in one of our previous slides. So we come back to where we started then. Helen Richardson describes how they sent 170 blooms to the London show recently, 190 varieties, but usually they'd send more flowers that are endlessly varied in colour, not just the familiar yellow. She says of the process that it would take 5 years to transform a daffodil seed into a bulb. And out of 5,000 seeds, you'd be lucky to be rewarded with 200 bulbs that you wanted to keep. And then there's this lovely quote, for as every daffodil grower knows, you spend 11 months of the year in anticipation and then have 1 month in purgatory, which I think is quite apt. It appears around this time in 1971 that the Waterford Corporation were looking to acquire the lands either of or surrounding Prospect House in Kilcohan. So Helen Richardson says to McCartan, there's always someone from the Waterford Municipal Administration proposing I sell them some land for housing development or the like. That of course would be the ruination of Prospect House, and there would be no sale while I'm alive to prevent it. And then there's another wonderful quote she gives, that people, I'm afraid, tend to forget how important flowers are in their lives. Very nice quote, very heartfelt quote there. In the article with the New Yorker, Helen also talks about the last flower that Lionel Richardson cultivated. So she says, one of the last that Lionel bred, Rose Caprice Infatuation cross called Romance, did mature until 2 years after his death. So it took 2 years to mature after his death. But it turned out to be the advance in pinks that he hoped for, and Helen made sure that the bulbs of romance went to the 12 individuals who subscribed £50 apiece to encourage Lionel in experimenting with this particular flower, which is large and lovely, 4.5 inches in diameter, and a beautiful blend of white and rose pink with just a touch of green at the base of the cup in its centre. So you can really see that it is a passion pursuit, that it wasn't necessarily purely business either, and that if they could cover their costs, that was a good year. So after the New Yorker piece, we know that Helen Richardson died in 1978, in around December of that year. The Munster Express notes that she died on the 11th of December, that her remains were removed to Christ Church Cathedral, Waterford, and her funeral took place there. We also know that a memorial service was to be held at a later date in London and was to be announced shortly after her funeral at Christ Church in Waterford. So now we come to our conclusion, nearly at the hour mark of our talk on Lionel and Helen Richardson. So we do know after Mrs. Richardson's death, after Helen's death, that basically a row occurred about the Daffodil farm and the sale of the 84-acre farm in Kilcohan. So we know there was a public inquiry held in Waterford in March 1980. Waterford Corporation was seeking confirmation of a compulsory order, CPO, for the acquisition of the land at, they describe in the Irish Independent, Ballytruckle, formerly owned by Ireland's Daffodil King, the late Lionel Richardson, who was world famous for his daffodil bulbs. The inquiry was told by the Waterford City Manager that the corporation had agreed to buy the land from Mrs. Richardson. A draft contract had been drawn up, but problems arose regarding title, and before Senior Council's opinion was available, 34 acres had been withdrawn and sold to a local greengrocer, a Mr. Michael Bulger of Ballybricken, Waterford. The piece goes on to say the remaining 50 acres had been offered to the corporation subject to renegotiation, but the City Council decided to acquire the entire block as a matter of urgent necessity for building of local authority houses. It then says Mr. Duty added that the farm was the largest tract of land near the city and already had all the necessary infrastructure. The corporation planned to build 600 houses which would provide accommodation for 2,000 people. Again, Mr. Duty said the prize-winning daffodils had been produced on the farm, but life had become totally miserable for Mrs. Richardson in later years due to trespass and mainly from adjoining housing estates. Buildings had been ripped apart, brick by vandals. Objecting to the granting of the compulsory order, the representatives of Mrs. Richardson and Mr. Bulger claim that suitable land is available in the corporation's land bank for the building of local authority houses at Upper Grange. The inquiry was presided over by Mr. R.M. Dobbin, Department Inspector, who adjourned the hearing to take evidence from a witness who had been injured in a traffic accident on his way to give evidence. The Kilkenny People of September 1980 noted the objectors, Mr. Bulger, and the representatives of the late Mrs. Richardson claim that suitable land is available for the building of houses at local authority tenants at Upper Grange, as previously noted in the Munster Express. And as you're all well aware, now we know there is no daffodil farm in Kilcohan, and that they were houses built subsequently. So again, even with both Lionel and Helen Richardson dead, no longer with us at this time in the 1980s, they were still very much in the local and national papers of the time. So I think from the research so far, it's very much a broad sketch of Lionel's life from 1890, and also the life of his wife Helen Richardson. And I think from Helen we really do get the voice of Lionel. So she's very important in not only being the supporter of Lionel's endeavours and his partner in life, but also from this very important New Yorker article, we get a flavour of his character and the thoughts of his process. Now, it's come to my attention that at the University of Ulster in Coleraine, there is an uncatalogued collection of material from the library of J. Lionel Richardson. So this is noted in the newsletter of the Northern Ireland Daffodil group from October 1982. And a D. Willis notes that there is some new light on Waterford and on Lionel Richardson's daffodil growing pursuits. So D. Willis obviously acquired some of these papers or library of Richardson, which is now held in the University of Ulster in Coleraine, and hopefully in time it would lead on to the next stage of learning more about this rather remarkable and forgotten man, and hopefully in turn shed some more insight on his wife Helen. So I hope you enjoyed this sketch of Lionel and Helen Richardson, two forgotten figures in Waterford history, in a very niche field, but certainly they were at the forefront of horticulture in Ireland, the UK and the world. So apologies for any mispronouncing. I'm sure it'll probably wrecked a lot of people's heads. So that's the conclusion of this slide. Once more, I'd like to thank Anne Cullen for everything, for her kindness and generosity and support, and for inviting me to just reveal some insights on Lionel and Helen Richardson. So if anyone would have any further information, I'm sure the Waterford Regional Gardening Club would be delighted to hear from you, and I certainly would as well. So take care everyone. Kind regards from me, Keen Manning.